Bro, I'm telling you, the world is jacked up. Yeah, I know. There's a lot of messed up stuff in the world. Well, you know what they say, right? The love of money is the root of all evil. No, it's not. What do you mean, no, it's not? First Timothy 6:10. But what does that mean in context? In what? What's up, everyone? Dane here. Welcome back to In Context, the channel that's all about helping you better understand the Bible in its proper context. In today's video, we're going to be looking at 1 Timothy 6:10. And today, I have a special guest with me, my brother, Zane. What's cracking, everybody? Good to be here. Just like you saw with our brief little conversation a second ago, you may have experienced or heard something similar before. No offense, Zane. Someone says to you, or maybe you hear someone on TV make this statement as if loving money is actually the source of all evil actions. And to those people that say that the love of money is the root of all evil and they leave it at that, I say to them, no, it's not. Okay, look at everybody. Dane is disagreeing with the Bible. Unsubscribe now and run away. Hold on a second, Zane. The isolated claim that the love of money is the root of all evil, while in the Bible, can be a misleading and incorrect statement if misunderstood to mean something that God did not intend for it to mean. I suppose that's fair. And oftentimes, when we hear this verse quoted in isolation, people don't realize they are misusing it. Part of the issue is the translation that words the verse like this, but the bigger issue is stripping this verse from its context. So we're going to look at this verse in context and see what is actually being said. But first, I want to show you how easily this is proven wrong in both day-to-day experience and from the Bible itself. Okay, let's see. Examples. Here's an everyday example. A guy robs a bank. Clearly, this guy did this evil because he loved money and he wanted it and he would steal to get it. How much clearer can it get? It can be easy to assume that he did this because he loves money. Stealing is evil. He stole money. Why else would he steal money unless he wanted it? And therefore, the love of money was the root of this evil, plain and simple. Or a guy robbed a bank because he needed money, not necessarily because he wanted money, to help his family because he loves his family and was desperate. He still committed a sin, and this does not justify his actions, but it was actually not out of love for money, but out of love for family. Well, I suppose if you put it that way. This is just one of many real-life examples of people sinning without having the thought of desiring money. People sin all the time with good intentions that have nothing to do with money. When we think of kids, the first sin they probably ever commit falls along the lines of either selfishness or disobedience. Kids have no concept of money right out the gate. They have to learn what money even is before they can love it in the way that this passage is talking about. But a child doesn't need to learn how to be selfish or disobedient. It comes quite naturally. Okay, you have a point there. Never thought about that. It's kind of easily proven wrong that loving money is the root or source of all evil actions, because it's simply not true. This verse isn't saying that, as we will soon see, and the Bible doesn't support that. Okay, whoa. Can we get an example from the Bible, please? Yes. By all means, please do not just take my word for it. We want to look at the Bible. We've seen some day-to-day examples. Now let's look at the Bible for an example. Okay, here's an Old Testament example. King David, heard of him? Yeah, the wealthiest man in the nation of Israel at the time. He had money, a lot of it. He didn't need more, and there's no indication that I'm aware of that suggests he desired more money. But one of King David's most famous blunders was the sin he committed regarding Bathsheba, another dude's wife. David lusted after a woman that he wasn't married to, which is sin in and of itself, but that inward desire led him to commit the outward act of adultery, and he essentially put her husband to death in the process. As horrible as this was, David didn't do it out of a love for money. He did it because he coveted another man's wife. He had all the money in the world. He wanted what he didn't have. In this case, Bathsheba. Okay, so you're doing a pretty good job of making me doubt this explanation of the text. But I assume you're not just going to leave me hanging and actually provide an alternative explanation? Sure thing, buddy. At this point, it should be fairly safe to say that 1 Timothy 6:10 cannot be saying that the love of money is literally the root of all evil, because that would be false and contradicted by Scripture itself. So if this isn't what is being said, then what is? Well, let's look at the context and see what's actually going on here. First things first, who wrote this letter? Does it tell us? Yes, it does. That's right. Right in the first chapter, the opening statement lets us know that the human author is none other than the good old Apostle Paul. Oh, yeah, I like Paul. Same. Pretty cool dude. So, Paul's writing to us. That's kind of cool. Well, not exactly. But I thought the New Testament was kind of geared towards the church. That's true, but we have to remember that the biblical writers were writing to specific individuals and people at a particular time in history. So that means that we have to understand what was being said to its initial audience and context so that we can figure out how it applies to us today. Okay, yeah, I guess that makes sense. There seems to be a lot of differences between today and biblical times. Now you're getting it. Okay, so Paul's the author. Who's he writing to? Good question. The title of this particular book kind of gives it away for us, but even if the name of this book wasn't 1 Timothy, we could easily find out by reading it. We are told that Paul is writing to Timothy 3 times within this book, twice in chapter 1 and once in chapter 6. Okay, so this Timothy fella seems to be the audience. Yes, the letter was written to Timothy, but that's not all. Paul was writing to Timothy to pass along some information to others. That brings us to the purpose of the letter. And what might that be? Probably finances, since he mentions the whole love of money thing, right? That's the funny thing. This letter really only mentions money briefly, and we'll get to that. But Paul is writing to Timothy for at least 3 reasons. 1, to defend the truth against false teachers. 2, to instruct how church leaders and local churches should operate. And 3, to encourage Timothy and other believers to live the Christian life well. Okay, with this background in mind, let's look at the immediate context of 1 Timothy 6:10. Let's do it. So, what version are we reading from? Now that is a very good question, Zane. Thank you. Why is that a good question? Well, remember earlier when I said that part of the problem with this verse being misused was due to a specific translation?
Part of the issue is the translation that words the verse like this, but the bigger issue is stripping this verse from its context.
I do recall you cryptically saying that without giving me any further information. Well, that's because it can be a sensitive topic, but it should be said that the King James Version, as good and classic of a translation as it is, it can cause confusion for some people on certain verses, and that's the case here. If you look at many other translations, such as the New King James Version, the English Standard Version, or the New American Standard Version, you will see the words all sorts of or all kinds of are added to this verse because in the Greek language and in the context of this passage, this is what would have been understood by the original audience. The translators of the New Testament are basically trying to help us who only understand English to better understand what the author means in our language. But regardless of the translation, the context will inform us of what is going on. Wow, okay, I did not know that, but I see why you didn't get into all of that right away. All right, so back to the text. And to answer your question, we're going to be looking at the New American Standard Version. Now, there's a very important indicator at the beginning of the verse that there is more to this verse than what we initially see. And that indicator is the word for. Here's a nice little Bible study tip for you. When you see the word for or therefore, you want to ask the question, what's it there for? That's easy to remember. I'll keep that in mind. Yeah, the word lets us know that something is being summed up or that it is following a train of thought that was being discussed. So let's quickly read our verse again, but this time we'll read the whole verse, this time from the NASB. For the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil, and some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. There's that indicator word, for. So, what's it there for? I also noticed that there was more to the back end of the verse than what is normally quoted. Good eye, Zane. Yes, there's our indicator word, and the end of the verse gives us the further hint that this is part of a larger discussion. Also, the way the NASB translates this verse really helps it not to feel like this whole absolute black and white statement. Yeah, I agree. This translation alone helps to clear up the verse by itself, but we still should check out the context to be safe. Right, okay, sounds good. So with spotting our indicator word, we should be able to look at what was being said before the verse at hand and find out what Paul was saying. Awesome! Lead the way, Broham. We'll pick up the conversation at the end of verse 2. Paul has finished giving the bulk of his instructions to Timothy and is telling him to teach and preach these principles, referring to the previous chapters where he was explaining those principles to Timothy. Then he pronounces a warning for Timothy against false teachers. If anyone advocates a different doctrine and does not agree with sound words, those of our Lord Jesus Christ, and with a doctrine conforming to godliness, he is conceited and understands nothing, but he has a morbid interest in controversial questions and disputes about words, out of which arise envy, strife, abusive language, evil suspicions, and constant friction between men of depraved mind and deprived of the truth, who suppose that godliness is a means of gain. Yeesh! That's quite the description. No kidding. The type of person this brings to mind in our day seems to be those religious scam artists like some televangelists, of whom I will not get into names here, but claiming to heal and provide blessings for a price seems to be like a similar vibe that was going on in Paul's day. True, it kind of seems like there are groups like that sprinkled out through history. You are definitely correct about that. But notice what's going on. Paul says who to look out for, those who disagree with Jesus. He says what they're like, gives this long negative description of them, and then explains why they're like this. They want to gain status or wealth. Oh, yeah, you're right. I can see that progression there. But also notice, Paul doesn't disagree totally that godliness is a means of gain. Listen to this. But godliness actually is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. For we have brought nothing into this world, so we cannot take anything out of it either. If we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. Wait, how is godliness of great gain if we're content with what we have? What does that even mean? In other words, Paul is saying that pursuing godliness for the right reasons is of great gain, not necessarily in this life because we can't bring anything with us from here, but for the life to come. This falls perfectly in line with Jesus' teachings about storing up treasures in heaven rather than on earth. Store up treasures in heaven? How do you do that? Well, we can't get into too much detail about that here, but briefly, if believers attempt to pursue godliness in this life, the world will hate them. But if someone who has believed in Jesus for the free gift of everlasting life endures through the temporary challenges that living godly lives brings now, his or her experience in God's future kingdom will be far greater than if they chose to live more like or blend into the rest of the world. Okay, whoa. That was a lot, and I definitely want to hear more about that at some point. But what does Paul say next? Yeah, sorry. That's a big topic that is found throughout the New Testament, but getting back to our text, this now leads us to verse 9 and then our verse. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Now we have come full circle back to our verse. Paul has just warned Timothy about false teachers who contradict Jesus' teachings, who don't actually understand the scriptures, and who want to gain something out of appearing godly. Paul then reminds Timothy that living a godly life as a believer is extremely beneficial for the life to come when it's coupled with contentment. This is because if one is doing things that seem godly, but they really aren't content in their hearts with what they have, then they are not living godly by God's standards. And finally, Paul points the finger at those who are basically obsessed with wanting to get rich as the end-all be-all of their lives. And to those people, he says, they fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and destruction. And it is in this context which Paul says those famous words, for the love of money is a root, not the root, of all sorts of, not all, evil. and some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. And that's the point. Some, by longing for it, longing for money, have wandered away from the faith and basically wrecked their lives along the way. Paul closes out this letter to Timothy by contrasting this mindset and way of living with an alternative mindset. Instead of desiring money and the many rabbit trail traps it leads to, he says, "But flee from these things, you man of God, and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, perseverance, and gentleness." He goes on to urge and remind Timothy to live the Christian life faithfully so that when Jesus returns, he won't be ashamed as he enters the kingdom, but will have an abundant entrance and will be found well-pleasing to God. Man, that is crazy, but I mean, it makes sense. It makes so much sense within the context. I cannot believe I've been missing this the whole time. But I do have a question, and this might sound kind of dumb, but does this mean that it's wrong to be rich or to, have a good paying job? That's not a dumb question, Zane. So many people ask this, and the answer is no, not at all. Paul even mentions at the end to inform those who are already rich not to be stingy or self-seeking with it, but use it for good, because at the end of the day, they can't bring any of that with them when this life is over. It's not the money that is the issue, but the heart behind the one holding the money. Okay, thank you for clearing that up. And I gotta say, bro, this has been super helpful. And I'm not just saying that. No problem, man. And I'm glad it was helpful. A lot more can be said about money in the Bible, but we'll have to save that for another video. Sounds good. Hey, do you have any other videos on popular verses or questions about the Bible? I sure do, buddy. And I'll be making more soon, so if you're interested in learning more about the Bible and how it applies to you, check out these videos. Awesome. And thanks for having me on here. Hopefully it's not the last time. Right? Yeah. Good to have you here as well, and we'll definitely have you back on at some point. Any final thoughts for anyone watching? Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, if you have made it this far into the video, you are world class, and I encourage you to subscribe if you haven't already, and to like this video so more people can get clarity on passages like this in the Bible. Peace. I didn't tell him to say that. Anyways, when reading your Bible, remember to keep it in context.